History is built not only on great empires and powerful kings, but also on moments of defiance, times when a handful of warriors or citizens chose to stand against overwhelming odds. Few of these moments are remembered with such awe as the stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae in 480 BCE. When people think of courage, sacrifice, and resistance against impossible odds, they think of Leonidas and his 300 warriors holding a narrow pass against the might of the Persian Empire. It is a tale retold countless times, a legend so powerful that it has shaped the way entire cultures think about bravery and freedom. But what really happened on that fateful day, when 300 Spartans resisted an army said to number 200,000? Was it pure myth, or was it a historical event grounded in strategy, geography, and human choice? To answer this, we must step back into the ancient world, a time of clashing civilizations. The early 5th century BCE was a period when the Greek city-states, independent and often quarreling among themselves, faced their greatest external threat, the expanding Persian Empire. Persia under King Darius I and later his son, Xerxes, had carved out one of the largest empires in history, stretching from modern-day Iran through Mesopotamia, Egypt, and into parts of Asia Minor. Its wealth, manpower, and resources dwarfed those of the fragmented Greek polis. From the Persian perspective, Greece was a small, rebellious frontier, a place to be subdued and folded into the empire's vast holdings. But Greece was more than a frontier. It was a patchwork of fiercely independent communities, bound by shared language, religion, and traditions, but divided by rivalries. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and dozens of smaller city-states all had their own governments, their own priorities, and often their own conflicts. Yet when Persia began its campaigns into the Greek world, threatening their autonomy and way of life, some of these states realized they had no choice but to band together or be conquered one by one. Among all the Greek city-states, none was as renowned for its military prowess as Sparta. Situated in the Peloponnese, Sparta was not a city of marble temples and philosophical debate, but a society organized almost entirely around warfare. From birth, Spartan males were groomed to be soldiers. At the age of 7, they entered the agage, a brutal training system that forged them into disciplined warriors. By adulthood, a Spartan was expected to fear nothing, to endure pain, hunger, and hardship without complaint, and above all, to fight to the death for the state. Sparta's reputation was one of iron discipline and unbreakable courage. When the Persian invasion loomed, it was to the Spartans that the Greeks looked for leadership in battle. The invasion that brought Xerxes and his massive army into Greece in 480 BCE was not the first clash between Persia and the Greek world. A decade earlier, in 490 BCE, Persian forces under Darius I had landed at Marathon, near Athens, only to be defeated by a smaller Greek force in a stunning victory. That loss had humiliated Persia, but it did not end their ambitions. Xerxes, who inherited the throne after Darius, sought both revenge and expansion. His campaign was one of the largest military expeditions the ancient world had ever seen. Greek historians like Herodotus claim that Xerxes' army numbered over 2 million men, though modern scholars suggest closer to 200,000 to 250,000. Still, even at the lower estimate, the Persians vastly outnumbered the Greek defenders. The Greeks knew they could not face the Persian army in open battle. The key to survival lay in using the terrain to their advantage, forcing the Persians into narrow spaces where numbers counted for less. This is where Thermopylae enters the story. Thermopylae, meaning hot gates, was a narrow coastal pass in central Greece. On one side, the steep mountains rose sharply. On the other, the sea pressed close. At certain points, the pass was so narrow that only a few men could fight side by side. For defenders, it was a natural choke point, perfect for holding off a larger force. When news spread that Xerxes was marching his vast army south through Greece, a coalition of Greek city-states met to decide how to respond. Athens prepared its navy, knowing that control of the sea would be vital. Sparta agreed to send troops to block the Persian advance on land. But due to religious festivals, the Carneia in Sparta, and the Olympic Games, Sparta initially sent only a small advance force under their king, Leonidas. That force was made up of 300 hand-picked Spartan hoplites, each accompanied by helots and supported by thousands of soldiers from other Greek cities. Together, this force may have numbered around 7,000 at the outset. Against the hundreds of thousands of Persians, it was a fraction. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in strategy, discipline, and determination. The decision to make a stand at Thermopylae was not purely military. It was symbolic. By standing in the narrow pass, the Greeks sent a message. They would not simply roll over and submit to Persia. They would fight even if outnumbered, even if doomed. This act of defiance was meant to buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare, to unite and to rally their forces. Leonidas and his men understood that they might not survive, but their sacrifice would give Greece a chance to endure. The stage was thus set for one of the most dramatic battles in history. Over 3 days, the Persians hurled wave after wave of soldiers against the Greek defenders at Thermopylae. The Spartans and their allies held the line, exploiting the narrowness of the pass to nullify the Persians' advantage in numbers. Their bronze shields, heavy spears, and relentless discipline turned back the might of an empire again and again. Only betrayal when a local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians, allowed Xerxes to outflank the defenders. Even then, Leonidas and his Spartans refused to retreat. They fought to the last man, buying with their lives a legacy that would echo through history. As we begin this journey into the true story of Thermopylae, we will peel back the legend to uncover the realities. Who the Spartans were, what kind of empire the Persians commanded, why Thermopylae was chosen, and how the battle unfolded across those fateful days. We will meet the figures at the heart of the story: Leonidas, Xerxes, and the nameless soldiers who gave their lives in the clash of civilizations. And we will examine why, more than 2,000 years later, the sacrifice of 300 Spartans still resonates. This is not simply the story of a battle. It is the story of defiance, of unity in the face of division, and of courage that transcends time. This is the story of the day 300 Spartans resisted an army of 200,000 warriors. To understand why 300 Spartans would willingly march to almost certain death at Thermopylae, we must first understand who they were and how their society was unlike any other in the ancient world. The legend of Sparta was not born in a single battle. It was the product of centuries of social engineering, discipline, and ruthless dedication to one purpose: creating the most formidable warriors the world had ever seen. The Spartan way of life. Sparta, located in the Peloponnese region of southern Greece, was never a city of gleaming temples like Athens or a hub of art and philosophy. Instead, it was a militarized society built on obedience, loyalty, and war. The Spartans lived by a rigid code that valued the collective above the individual. Personal freedom, wealth, and comfort were sacrificed for the strength of the state. This was a society where military service was not merely a duty, but the very essence of life. Sparta's system was unique among the Greek city-states. Most Greek poleis had citizen assemblies, trade economies, and diverse classes. Sparta, by contrast, structured itself around two main classes: the Spartiates, or full citizens who were professional soldiers, and the Helots, an enslaved population of conquered peoples who worked the land. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans by a wide margin, which created constant tension and fear of revolt. To maintain control, Sparta turned its entire male population into a warrior caste. Every Spartiate was expected to be a soldier, ready at all times to defend against both external enemies and internal rebellion. This dual reality, external threats from rivals like Athens and Persia, and internal threats from the restless Helot population, drove Sparta to forge one of the most disciplined armies in history. Unlike other Greek states where men could choose careers in trade, politics, or the arts, in Sparta, a man's only acceptable profession was war. The agoge, forging warriors from childhood. The backbone of Spartan culture was the agog, the state-run education and training system. From the age of 7, boys were taken from their families and placed in communal barracks. There, they were subjected to harsh discipline, physical training, and lessons in endurance. The goal of the agog was not to create scholars or merchants, but warriors who were physically strong, mentally tough, and utterly loyal to the state. Spartan boys learned how to hunt, wrestle, and fight. They were deliberately underfed, forced to steal food to survive, but punished if caught. Not for stealing, but for failing to steal cleverly. This taught them cunning and resourcefulness. They were beaten regularly to toughen their bodies and spirits. They were taught to endure pain silently, without complaint, a value captured in the famous phrase, Laconian brevity. Short, sharp speech with no wasted words. By adolescence, Spartan youths trained with weapons, learned formation fighting, and underwent rituals designed to test their courage. One of the most notorious was the Cryptia, a kind of secret police and rite of passage. Young Spartans were sent into the countryside armed only with knives, tasked with surviving and even terrorizing Helots to remind them of their subjugated status. Such practices hardened the young men, instilling fearlessness and ruthlessness. At age 20, a Spartan male became eligible to join the army, though full citizenship came later at 30, when he was admitted into one of the mess halls where Spartans dined together. Even then, military service did not end. A Spartan was expected to serve actively until the age of 60. From birth to old age, the Spartan life was centered on war. Women in Sparta, the keepers of strength. Interestingly, Spartan women lived lives very different from their counterparts in other Greek city-states. In Athens, women were often confined to the household, their roles restricted to domestic duties. In Sparta, however, women were expected to be strong, healthy, and capable of bearing warriors. They received physical training, could own property, and spoke their minds more freely than women elsewhere in Greece. Spartan mothers were famously tough. One saying attributed to them captures the ethos when handing a shield to her son. Before battle, mother would say, "Return with it," or "on it." In other words, come back victorious, or come back dead, but never come back having thrown away your shield and fled. Women reinforced the warrior culture, ensuring that Spartan men were constantly reminded of their duty to the state. The Spartan phalanx, discipline in action. The ultimate expression of Spartan culture was the phalanx, the tightly packed infantry formation of hoplites, or heavily armed foot soldiers, armed with long spears, short swords, and large bronze shields. The Spartans fought shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping shield, forming an impenetrable wall of men. What made the Spartan phalanx unique was its discipline. While other Greek armies could break ranks under pressure, Spartans were drilled to perfection. Each man trusted his neighbor completely. Survival depended on it. In battle, the Spartans moved as one, advanced as one, and killed as one. They did not fight for personal glory, but for the survival of their formation and, by extension, their city-state. This level of training and cohesion allowed the Spartans to hold their ground against forces many times their size. They were not invincible, history records, defeats as well as victories, but their reputation was so fearsome that enemies often hesitated to face them in open battle. Sparta's dual kingship and politics. Another unique feature of Sparta was its political system. Unlike most Greek city-states that had either kings, oligarchies, or democracies, Sparta had two kings simultaneously, drawn from two royal families. One king would typically lead the army in the field, while the other remained in Sparta to govern. This unusual system was balanced by a council of elders, the Gerousia, and an assembly of male citizens, ensuring that no single man could dominate completely. This dual kingship was both a strength and a weakness. On the one hand, it allowed for continuity of leadership during military campaigns. On the other, it sometimes led to rivalry between the two kings. By the time of the Persian invasions, Sparta's king was Leonidas I, a descendant of the heroic lineage that traced itself back to Heracles. Leonidas would become the face of Spartan resistance at Thermopylae. The reputation of Sparta. By the early 5th century BCE, Sparta's reputation was unmatched in Greece. They were respected, feared, and sometimes resented by other city-states. Athens excelled in naval power and intellectual life, Corinth in trade, and Thebes in agriculture. But Sparta was synonymous with military strength. When Greeks needed a decisive land force, they turned to the Spartans. This reputation came at a cost. Spartans lived under constant tension, with little luxury or artistic expression compared to other Greeks. They produced no great philosophers like Socrates, no playwrights like Sophocles, and no architects of dazzling temples. Their art was war, and their legacy was their battlefield discipline. This militaristic society set the stage for the events of Thermopylae. When Xerxes marched into Greece with his colossal army, it was Leonidas and his 300 Spartans who symbolized the Greek will to resist. The choice to face overwhelming odds was not an accident of history. It was the natural result of centuries of cultural conditioning. Spartans were taught from birth that death in battle was the highest honor, and that retreat or surrender was shameful beyond measure. The men who stood at Thermopylae were not ordinary soldiers. They were the products of a society that had forged them into weapons. They were men who had trained their entire lives for that moment, who carried not only spears and shields, but the weight of a culture built on sacrifice. Their resistance against Persia was not just military, it was ideological. It was the clash of a free but harshly disciplined people against the might of a wealthy empire that demanded submission. In the chapters that follow, we will see how these men, shaped by their society, confronted the greatest army of their age. But before the first spear was thrown at Thermopylae, we must understand the empire that sought to conquer. Greece, the Persian colossus under Xerxes, whose ambition would bring him face to face with the iron wall of Spartan resolve. To understand the magnitude of what 300 Spartans faced at Thermopylae, we must step back and look at the colossal force that marched against them. The Persian Empire was not just another regional power. It was the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, stretching across 3 continents, from the valleys of the Indus in the east to the shores of the Aegean in the west, from the deserts of Egypt in the south to the steppes of Central Asia in the north. To face Persia was to stand against a superpower of unimaginable wealth, manpower, and ambition. The rise of the Persian Empire. The story begins in the mid-6th century BCE with Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty. Cyrus expanded from the Persian homeland in modern-day Iran to conquer Media, Lydia, and Babylon, establishing an empire that was remarkable, not only for its size, but for its tolerance and administrative sophistication. The Persians ruled over diverse peoples: Babylonians, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, Greeks of Asia Minor, allowing them to retain their customs and religions so long as they paid tribute and acknowledged Persian authority. After Cyrus came Darius I, often called Darius the Great. He consolidated the empire, reorganizing it into provinces known as satrapies, each overseen by a governor or satrap. This administrative system allowed the Persians to govern vast territories efficiently. Darius also built the Royal Road, a network of highways that stretched over 2,500 kilometers, enabling messages and armies to move swiftly across the empire. Persia's wealth flowed from its ability to tax, control trade routes, and draw on the resources of subject peoples. Yet for all its power, Persia's reach into Europe was not uncontested. The Greeks of Asia Minor, particularly the Ionian cities along the coast of modern-day Turkey, resented Persian rule. In 499 BCE, they rose in revolt in what is known as the Ionian Revolt, supported in part by Athens and Eretria. Though the revolt was crushed, it sparked a Persian desire for vengeance. Darius in the first Persian invasion of Greece, Darius set his sights on punishing Athens and Eretria for aiding the Ionian rebels. In 490 BCE, he launched the first Persian invasion of Greece, sending a fleet across the Aegean. The Persians landed at Marathon, where they were met by a smaller but determined Athenian force. Against the odds, the Athenians won a stunning victory, driving the Persians back to their ships. The Battle of Marathon became legendary, proving that the Persians were not invincible and giving Greece a sense of hope. But the Persians did not forget their defeat. Darius began planning a second, larger invasion to crush Greece once and for all. He died before it could be carried out, leaving the task to his son, Xerxes III. Xerxes, the King of Kings. Xerxes inherited the throne in 486 BCE. Tall, imposing and commanding, Xerxes embodied Persian majesty. The Persians referred to their monarch as the King of Kings, for he ruled not just one land but many, and all kings within his empire bowed to him. Yet Xerxes was also ambitious and proud, determined to succeed where his father had failed. For Xerxes, the invasion of Greece was not simply about punishing Athens. It was about extending Persian dominance into Europe and demonstrating the might of the Achaemenid dynasty. In his court at Persepolis, surrounded by wealth and advisors from across the empire, Xerxes began assembling the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. The Great Army. Ancient sources, particularly Herodotus, describe Xerxes' army as numbering in the hundreds of thousands, even millions, while modern historians debate the exact size, some estimating closer to 200,000. The scale was undeniably vast. The army included Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Scythians, and Greeks from Asia Minor. Each contingent brought its own weapons, dress, and fighting style, creating a multi-ethnic force that symbolized the empire's diversity. There were cavalry units, including Persian horsemen and fearsome riders from Central Asia. There were archers from the east, skilled in the composite bow. There were heavily armed infantry with spears and shields, and light troops armed with slings and javelins. Most famous of all were the Immortals, an elite corps of 10,000 soldiers, whose numbers were always maintained. If one fell, another immediately replaced him. They were the personal guard of the king, adorned in ornate uniforms, their very name striking fear into enemies. Behind the army marched engineers, supply carriers, and laborers. The Persians understood that an army marched not just on courage, but on logistics. Supply lines stretched back across Asia, with food, weapons, and equipment transported by land and sea. Warships escorted supply fleets along the coast, ensuring the army could feed itself as it moved. Engineering feats crossing into Greece. Xerxes' invasion was not only a military undertaking, but an engineering marvel. To cross the Hellespont, the strait separating Asia from Europe, today known as the Dardanelles, Xerxes ordered the construction of two massive pontoon bridges made of ships lashed together. When an early attempt was destroyed by storms, Xerxes reportedly flew into a rage, ordering the waters whipped and chained as punishment. A story Herodotus records with both awe and amusement. Eventually, the bridges were rebuilt, and Xerxes' army crossed from Asia into Europe, a river of men and horses stretching for miles. As they advanced, Greek spies reported their movements, and the Greek city-states realized that they faced an existential threat. The Greek response: unity in crisis. The Greek world was famously divided, Athens and Sparta. Though the two most powerful city-states were often rivals, Athens prided itself on its democracy and naval power. Sparta valued its oligarchic military discipline. Other city-states like Corinth, Thebes, and Delphi had their own interests, and were reluctant to submit to outside leadership. But Xerxes' invasion changed the calculus. If Greece did not unite, it would be swallowed by Persia. In 481 BCE, a Congress of Greek states was held at Corinth, where they agreed to form a defensive alliance. Sparta, with its unmatched land forces, was given command of the army, while Athens, with its growing fleet, took command of the navy. This uneasy cooperation would prove crucial in the battles to come. The strategy holding the gates. The Greeks understood they could not face Xerxes' massive army head-on in open battle. They needed to use geography to their advantage, to funnel the Persians into narrow spaces where numbers would count for less. Two critical choke points were identified: the narrow pass of Thermopylae on land and the Straits of Artemisium at sea. The plan was simple yet daring. A small Greek force would hold the pass at Thermopylae, delaying the Persians and buying time for the Greek fleet to harass their supply lines at Artemisium. If they could hold long enough, unity among the Greeks might solidify, and the Persians could be forced into a costly stalemate. At the heart of this plan was King Leonidas of Sparta, who volunteered to lead a force north to Thermopylae. Though he brought only 300 Spartan warriors, they would be joined by several thousand allies from other Greek states. Still, the odds were staggering. Against them marched an empire. The stage is set. By the summer of 480 BCE, Xerxes' colossal army had entered Greece, burning towns and demanding submission. Some cities surrendered while others fled. But at Thermopylae, a small band of Greeks prepared to make their stand. For Xerxes, it was a chance to crush resistance early and prove the futility of opposing Persia. For Leonidas and his Spartans, it was the moment they had been born and bred for, to stand against impossible odds, to embody the Spartan ideal that death in battle was the noblest fate. The clash was inevitable. The greatest empire of its age was about to meet the most disciplined warriors of Greece. What followed at Thermopylae would echo through history, not merely as a battle, but as a symbol of resistance against overwhelming power. The year was 480 BCE, and the shadow of Persia loomed over the Greek world. The decisions made in those weeks would determine the survival or the destruction of Hellenic civilization. Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass hugging the Malian Gulf, would become the chosen battleground. But the road to that decision was as critical as the clash itself. This chapter explores how King Leonidas and his Spartans came to march north, how the Greeks weighed their options, and why Thermopylae became the fated ground where history would be written. Leonidas, the warrior king. At the heart of the story is Leonidas I, the warrior king of Sparta. Unlike many monarchs of the ancient world, Leonidas was not raised in luxury. He had undergone the brutal Spartan agoge, the rigorous military training every Spartan boy endured. From the age of 7, he had lived in barracks, trained to endure hunger, pain, and cold, and taught to obey orders without hesitation. By the time he reached manhood, he had become the embodiment of Spartan discipline, toughness, and sacrifice. Leonidas was not the eldest son of his father, Anaxandridas and had not originally been destined for kingship, but fate intervened. With the deaths of his elder brothers, Leonidas ascended to the throne. This meant that when Xerxes threatened Greece, Leonidas was the man chosen to lead the defense. He was not a tyrant nor a distant ruler. He was one of them, a soldier first and a king second. The Greek Congress at Corinth. As the Persians advanced, the Greeks gathered once again at Corinth to strategize. The arguments were fierce. Some city-states argued for submission to Persia, claiming resistance was futile. Others, especially Athens and Sparta, insisted that freedom was worth the risk of annihilation. Athens was in a precarious position. Though it had defeated the Persians at Marathon a decade earlier, its city was exposed, lying directly in the path of the advancing army. Its leader, Themistocles, argued that Greece's salvation lay not on land but at sea. He had recently convinced Athens to invest in a powerful navy, built with the silver mines of Laurium. To him, the fleet was the key, but a fleet alone could not stop Persia's land forces. Someone had to hold the line on land. That responsibility fell to Sparta, and so, when the Greeks debated where to make their stand, It was the Spartan king Leonidas who stepped forward. Why Thermopylae? Geography shaped the choice. The Persians had numbers, but Greece was a land of narrow mountain passes and rugged coastlines. By forcing Xerxes' army into confined spaces, the Greeks could offset the advantage of sheer manpower. Thermopylae was ideal. The pass, whose name means hot gates due to nearby sulfur springs, was a narrow strip of land at points only, 15 meters wide, sandwiched between steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other. Here the Persians could not deploy their full army. Their vast numbers would be bottlenecked, forced to fight in waves rather than overwhelming the Greeks all at once. Moreover, Thermopylae was positioned strategically. It guarded the gateway into central Greece. If Leonidas could hold the pass, Athens and the Peloponnesian states would have time to mobilize their fleets and armies. It was a gamble, but a calculated one. The numbers game. Leonidas knew that Sparta could not send its full army. At the time of the invasion, Sparta was observing the Carnea festival, a sacred religious event during which the Spartans were forbidden to march to war. To break this tradition outright would risk offending the gods and the Spartan elders. Yet the threat was too great to ignore. As a compromise, Leonidas was permitted to take his personal guard, 300 hand-picked Spartans, on what was officially a reconnaissance mission. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were chosen from men who already had living sons, ensuring that their bloodline would continue if they fell. Alongside them, other Greek contingents joined, around 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, 1,000 Phocians, and several thousand more from smaller city-states. Total, the force may have numbered between 6,000 and 7,000. Compared to Xerxes' vast host, this was a mere sliver. Yet Leonidas knew that discipline and strategy could achieve what numbers alone could not: the march north. The march from Sparta to Thermopylae was both solemn and inspiring. Leonidas and his 300 warriors donned their crimson cloaks and polished bronze armor. Each carried the hoplon, a heavy round shield along with a spear and sword. Their armor gleamed. Their hair was combed and oiled, a ritual that Spartans performed before battle, not out of vanity but as a statement of readiness for death. Herodotus tells us that as they marched, their reputation preceded them. To the Greeks who saw them, these Spartans seemed like men who already knew their fate. They did not expect to return. They were marching not for victory, but for immortality. Along the way, Leonidas gathered additional allies, swelling the Greek force. The small army pressed north, passing towns whose citizens either cheered them or fled in terror of the Persians. For Leonidas, every step forward was a step into legend. The spirit of the Greeks. It is worth pausing to understand what drove these men. Unlike the Persians, who were subjects of a king, the Greeks fought as free men defending their homes. The Athenians prided themselves on their democracy. The Spartans prized their austere military way of life. Even the smaller city-states cherished their autonomy. To submit to Persia was to abandon everything that made them Greek. This was not merely a clash of armies. It was a clash of values. The Greeks, with their fierce independence, stood against an empire that demanded submission. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans embodied that defiance. Arrival at Thermopylae. By the time Leonidas arrived at the Hot Gates, Xerxes' army was already moving through Thessaly to the north. The Persians were an unstoppable tide, burning towns and demanding surrender as they advanced. Local Greek populations were terrified, and some even capitulated without a fight. At Thermopylae, Leonidas inspected the terrain. The pass was even narrower than expected in places, bordered by mountains that could be fortified and watched. The Greeks quickly set to work repairing an old wall that blocked part of the road, strengthening it with stone and timber. This wall would serve as their defensive line. Behind it, they would meet the Persian advance. To the Spartans, this was familiar ground. Their entire training had prepared them for close-quarters combat. Shield against shield, spear against flesh. The Persians, with their lighter armor and reliance on archers, would find themselves at a disadvantage in such a confined space. The calm before the storm. As they prepared their defenses, scouts brought word of the Persian army's size. Stories tell of a force so vast that it drank rivers dry, that its numbers darkened the plains like swarms of locusts. Whether exaggerated or not, the Greeks knew they faced a foe of overwhelming might. Still, Leonidas remained calm. To his men, he spoke not of fear, but of duty. One famous exchange illustrates this spirit. When a local told the Spartans that Persian arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan warrior is said to have replied, "Then we shall fight in the shade." The stage was set. Thermopylae would be the line in the sand, the place where free men defied an empire. Leonidas and his men knew they could not win in the conventional sense, but they also knew that their sacrifice could inspire the rest of Greece, buying time for Athens to prepare its fleet and for Sparta to gather its full army. And so they waited. Across the gulf, the great Persian army advanced, banners fluttering, drums beating, weapons glinting in the sun. At its head rode Xerxes, confident that no handful of Greeks could resist him. He was about to be proven wrong. The narrow pass of Thermopylae had grown tense with silence. On one side stood Leonidas and his coalition of Greek warriors, their shields glinting in the sun, their spears braced for combat. On the other side, stretching as far as the eye could see, the immense army of Persia under Xerxes. The moment had arrived. The standoff was more than a test of strength. It was a test of will. For days leading up to the clash, Xerxes believed he could cow the Greeks into submission. Yet what unfolded was one of the most defiant stands in recorded history. Xerxes' confidence. Xerxes was accustomed to victory. His father, Darius I, had failed at Marathon. But the son came determined to avenge the Persian humiliation. To him, Greece was a small, fractured land of bickering city-states, hardly a match for the wealth and might of the Persian Empire. From his throne set upon a golden platform overlooking the battlefield, Xerxes could see the Greeks fortifying their wall. He found it laughable. To the Persian king, the narrow pass was a temporary inconvenience. Sheer numbers would crush these defenders in an instant. Xerxes sent a herald to demand their surrender. In a booming voice, the messenger called out, "Lay down your weapons, Greeks, and you may yet live." Leonidas's reply would echo through history. "Molon Labe, come and take them." This was no ordinary refusal. It was a challenge, a declaration that the Greeks had no intention of bending the knee. The first assault. On the morning of the first attack, the Persians advanced in formation. Xerxes ordered his Medes, one of his most elite units, to lead the assault. These were warriors with experience, veterans of campaigns across the empire. Surely the king thought they could sweep away this small Greek force. But as they approached the wall, the reality of Thermopylae became clear. The pass funneled them into a narrow front, where only a fraction of their soldiers could engage at once. Instead of a vast army overwhelming the defenders, the Persians were forced into a confined clash, their numbers reduced to mere hundreds against the tight Greek phalanx. The Spartans and their allies fought in disciplined unison, shoulder to shoulder. Their hoplons overlapped to form a solid wall of bronze, spears thrust forward in perfect rhythm, striking at the unarmored faces and throats of the Persians. Behind the first rank, others pushed forward, creating a living machine of war. The Medes charged again and again, but each time they were repelled. The Greeks rotated their lines, allowing tired men to fall back and fresh warriors to take their place. Hours dragged on, and the Persian dead piled up at the base of the wall. The shock of resistance. From his throne, Xerxes watched in disbelief. His most trusted warriors had failed to break through. The Greeks were not fleeing, nor were they crumbling under the pressure. Instead, they fought with ferocity, as if death itself meant nothing. He ordered more troops into the fray. Wave after wave surged forward, only to be met by the unyielding phalanx. Spears shattered, arrows fell, swords clashed against bronze shields, but the Greeks held firm. Herodotus writes that Xerxes leapt from his seat 3 times in rage as he saw his soldiers driven back. The great king, who commanded the largest army the world had yet seen, could not comprehend how a handful of men were resisting him. The Spartans' tactics. The key to the Greeks' defense was discipline. The Spartans in particular had perfected the art of the phalanx. Each warrior's shield protected not only himself, but the man beside him. To break the line, the Persians had to penetrate not a single fighter, but an entire wall of bronze and iron. Moreover, Leonidas employed cunning tactics. At times, the Spartans pretended to retreat, luring the Persians into the narrowest point of the pass, before suddenly wheeling around and cutting them down. The confined terrain turned Persian numbers into a disadvantage. Their men stumbled over the bodies of their fallen comrades, unable to maneuver effectively. The contrast between the two sides was stark. The Persians favored lighter armor, with wicker shields and short spears, against the heavy bronze shields and long spears of the Greeks. They were at a disadvantage in close combat. By the end of the first day, the Persians had suffered staggering losses. The Greeks had not only held the pass, they had humiliated the greatest empire of the age. Xerxes, furious at the failure of his Medes, unleashed his elite guard, the Immortals, so named because their ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000 men. The Immortals were the pride of the Persian army. Armed with spears, swords, and bows, they were considered unbeatable. As they marched forward in their ornate uniforms, the Greeks braced themselves. If any unit could break the phalanx, it was the Immortals. But once again, the terrain betrayed them. In the confines of the Hot Gates, the Immortals found themselves no more effective than the Medes. Their arrows were useless against the wall of shields, and in close combat, their shorter weapons could not match the reach of the Greek spears. The Spartans fought with renewed vigor, determined to prove that no man, mortal or immortal, could breach their line. Herodotus tells us that the Immortals, too, were driven back with heavy casualties. The night falls. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the battlefield was strewn with Persian corpses. Thousands lay dead, while the Greeks had suffered only minimal losses. The defenders returned to their camp, their morale soaring. They had not only survived the first day, they had made a mockery of Xerxes' might. Around their campfires, the Greeks sang songs and told stories, their spirits lifted by the day's success. Yet they knew this was only the beginning. The Persians would return the next morning, and the fighting would only grow fiercer. Xerxes, meanwhile, was enraged. His pride had been wounded, and his army had suffered humiliating losses. He vowed that the next day would bring victory. Day 2, renewed fury. At dawn, the Persians returned with renewed determination. Xerxes hurled more troops into the pass, determined to exhaust the Greeks through sheer attrition. But once again, the narrow terrain gave the defenders the advantage. The phalanx held strong, and the Greeks rotated their forces to keep fresh men at the front. Each time the Persians surged forward, they were beaten back. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, shield against shield. The ground became slick with blood, and the cries of the wounded echoed off the mountains. Yet the Greeks never wavered. By midday, the Persians were once again in retreat, their losses mounting. Xerxes, frustrated and humiliated, faced a bitter reality. Brute force alone would not break Thermopylae. The turning point approaches. Despite their success, Leonidas and his men knew their position was precarious. They were vastly outnumbered and supplies were limited. Every day they held the pass was a day bought for the rest of Greece. But their own survival was far from guaranteed. Still they fought on, driven by duty and by the knowledge that their sacrifice could inspire the rest of Greece to stand against Persia. What they could not have foreseen was that their greatest threat would not come from the Persian front, but from betrayal behind their lines. The Persian retreat after Salamis was not the end of the war. Xerxes may have returned to Asia, but he left behind a powerful army under the command of his trusted general, Mardonius, to finish what Thermopylae and Salamis had not. For Greece, the shadow of Persia still loomed large. The final test of courage, discipline, and unity would come not at sea, but on land, on the broad plains near a city called Plataea, the Persian strategy. Mardonius was no ordinary commander. He was experienced, ruthless, and deeply loyal to Xerxes. Though the Persian fleet had been shattered at Salamis, Mardonius believed that victory was still possible if he could force the Greeks into a decisive land battle. He chose to winter in northern Greece, consolidating his forces. He rebuilt morale, secured supply lines, and courted disloyal Greek city-states with promises of power. He also attempted diplomacy, sending envoys to Athens with offers of peace. Persia would spare Athens, even reward it, if the city abandoned its alliance with Sparta. The Athenians rejected the offer outright. For them, the memory of their burning city was too fresh. They sent a message to Sparta: "We will never betray Greece. Even if we must stand alone, we will resist." This defiance rallied the rest of the city-states. By spring of 479 BCE, a massive Greek force assembled, determined to confront Persia once and for all. The Greek alliance, Plataea, the Greeks brought together an army larger than any they had ever fielded. Roughly 100,000 men, though numbers vary in ancient accounts, gathered under the banner of unity. For once, bitter rivals set aside their quarrels. Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians, Megarians, and others marched side by side. At the head of this coalition was the Spartan regent Pausanias, nephew of Leonidas. The weight of Spartan honor and the memory of Thermopylae rested heavily on his shoulders. To him and his men, Plataea was not merely a battle, it was an opportunity to avenge the death of Leonidas in the 300. The plains of Plataea. The battlefield chosen was both strategic and symbolic. The plains near Plataea offered room for both cavalry and infantry maneuvers, but they were bordered by difficult terrain, streams, ridges, and broken ground that could complicate large formations. For Mardonius, whose Persian cavalry was among his greatest assets, the flat terrain seemed ideal. The Greeks, however, were cautious. They remembered well how the Persians had used cavalry to devastating effect in earlier campaigns. Their strength lay in their phalanx, tight formations of heavily armored hoplites with long spears and heavy shields. If they could hold formation and avoid being outflanked, they could stand firm. The opening moves. The battle began with harassment. Persian cavalry, led by the commander Mecistius, charged at the Greek lines, showering them with arrows and javelins. The Greeks endured the attacks grimly, shields locked, waiting for an opportunity. Mecistius himself, resplendent in armor and riding a magnificent horse, became the focus of the Greek resistance. In a fierce clash, he was struck down, his death sending shockwaves through the Persian army. His body was paraded before the Greek troops, lifting morale and reminding them that even the proud Persian cavalry could be broken. But Mardonius did not falter. He tightened his grip on the battlefield, cutting Greek supply lines and forcing them into a precarious position. Soon, hunger and thirst gnawed at the Greek camp. Pausanias knew that delay could spell disaster. The clash of armies. The final confrontation erupted in chaos. Forced to reposition at night to secure water and supply lines, the Greek army became scattered. Mardonius seized the opportunity, launching a massive assault. Persian cavalry and infantry surged forward, seeking to crush the disorganized Greeks. But as dawn broke, the scattered Greek contingents regrouped with remarkable discipline. The Spartans, positioned on the right flank, faced the elite Persian infantry head-on. Their phalanx locked shields and advanced steadily, spears thrusting in deadly rhythm. Mardonius himself commanded the Persian center, mounted on a white horse, rallying his men with cries of vengeance for Salamis. But the Greek hoplites were relentless. Step by step, they drove into the Persian lines, their heavy armor deflecting arrows, their long spears piercing lighter Persian shields. Then came the critical moment. Mardonius, fighting bravely at the front, was struck down by a Spartan spear. His death shattered Persian morale. What had been a fierce struggle quickly unraveled into chaos as the Persian army broke ranks. The rout of the Persians, The retreat turned into a slaughter. The Persians, unfamiliar with the terrain and harried by relentless Greek pursuit, were cut down in droves. Many fled to a fortified camp, but the Greeks stormed it with ferocious determination. By the end of the day, the Persian army in Greece had been annihilated. It was a stunning reversal. The same empire that had marched into Greece with hundreds of thousands of men and the wealth of Asia at its back had been broken by a coalition of small, quarrelsome city-states. Thermopylae had been a heroic stand. Salamis a cunning victory, but Plataea was the conclusive blow. The significance of Plataea. Plataea was more than just a battlefield triumph. It was the end of Persia's dream of conquering mainland Greece. While the empire remained vast and powerful, its aura of invincibility had been shattered. No longer would Greek city-states live under the shadow of inevitable Persian domination. For Sparta, it was a moment of vindication. The death of Leonidas and the sacrifice of the 300 had not been in vain. For Athens, it reinforced the power of their fleet and their role as defenders of freedom. Together, the victors of Plataea laid the foundation for a new era in Greek history, the rise of Athens as a cultural and naval superpower, and the continued dominance of Sparta on land. The dual victory, Plataea and Mycale, on the very same day as Plataea, far across the Aegean. Another clash sealed the fate of the war. At Mycale, the Greek navy struck at the remnants of the Persian fleet. Beached on the Ionian coast, the Persians, already shaken by defeat, were routed once again. 2 victories, one by land and one by sea, ensured that Persia would never again mount a full-scale invasion of Greece. Legacy of Plataea. The memory of Plataea echoed for centuries. To the Greeks, it was proof that courage, discipline, and unity could overcome even the greatest of empires. To the world, it became a lesson in the power of free men fighting for their homeland. For Pausanias, the victory was a personal triumph, though his later life would be clouded by suspicion and controversy. For the ordinary hoplites, farmers, craftsmen, and citizens who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx, it was an immortal moment when they had defended not only their cities, but the very idea of freedom itself. Plataea was the final act of the Great Invasion. Persia remained a colossus, stretching from Asia Minor to the Indus, but Greece had proven that even the mightiest empire could be resisted. The sacrifices of Thermopylae, the brilliance of Salamis, and the courage of Plataea formed a trilogy of defiance that defined an age. It was, as the historian Herodotus would later say, not merely a battle for land, but a battle for the soul of Greece. When the dust settled at Plataea and Mycale, Greece had done the unthinkable. They had resisted the greatest empire of their age. The invasion of Xerxes, which had begun with unstoppable momentum, ended in crushing defeat. Yet of all the battles fought, of all the sacrifices made, one story towered above them all: the stand of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the making of a legend. Thermopylae was, in military terms, a defeat. The Persians broke through, Athens was burned, and much of Greece lay vulnerable. Yet it was precisely in that defeat that legend was born. The courage of the Spartans, fighting to the last breath against impossible odds, transformed Thermopylae from a tactical loss into a moral victory. Greek poets and storytellers spread the tale. Herodotus, the father of history, recorded it in his histories. Bards recited the deeds of Leonidas, who refused to abandon his post even when survival was impossible. The story resonated not only with Greeks, but with anyone who heard it. Small band of warriors standing defiant against overwhelming force. It became the archetype of heroism, a symbol that freedom was worth dying for. The Spartan ethos. Central to this legend was the Spartan way of life. Unlike other Greek states, Sparta was a warrior society. From childhood, Spartan boys were taken from their families and trained in the agage, a brutal system designed to produce disciplined, fearless soldiers. They were taught to endure hunger, pain, and hardship without complaint. Honor in battle was the highest virtue, cowardice the greatest disgrace. This ethos shaped the stand at Thermopylae, Leonidas and his men did not expect to survive. They expected to inspire by holding the pass as long as possible. They gave the rest of Greece precious time to prepare. Their refusal to surrender became a living embodiment of the Spartan creed, with your shield or on it. The message to Greece. The 300 Spartans were not alone at Thermopylae. Thousands of allies fought alongside them, Thespians, Thebans, and others. Yet in the Greek imagination, it was the Spartans who became immortal. Why? Because they represented a simple, unforgettable idea that freedom requires sacrifice. At a time when many Greek city-states were divided, wavering or tempted by Persian gold, the Spartans sent a message carved not in stone, but in blood. We will resist no matter the cost. That message echoed through Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale, stiffened spines and silenced doubts. Thermopylae proved that even in defeat, resistance could inspire victory. The Persian perspective. To Persia, Thermopylae was a minor obstacle. Xerxes lost days, not months, and he crushed the defenders. Yet even Persian accounts acknowledge the unusual bravery of the Greeks. In an empire built on conquest, Thermopylae was not remembered as a decisive battle, but as an example of how fiercely some people would fight to remain unconquered. The story of the 300 Spartans, standing shoulder to shoulder at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, is one of the most enduring tales in all of human history. Over 2,000 years have passed since that fateful summer of 480 BCE, when Leonidas and his warriors made their last stand against Xerxes and the Persian horde. Yet the memory of that battle continues to echo across the ages, through poems, monuments, histories, and films. Why? Because Thermopylae was more than a battle, it was a statement. A message carved not in stone but in sacrifice. The timeless symbol, Thermopylae, endures because it represents something far greater than the clash of armies. It embodies the eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny, between defiance and submission, between the few and the many. For the Spartans and their allies, death at Thermopylae was not defeat, it was immortality. By choosing resistance over surrender, they proved that courage can outshine conquest, and that even in annihilation, a legacy can be born. Generations have remembered the Spartans not because they won, but because they refused to yield. Their stand transformed a military defeat into a moral triumph. Thermopylae became the spark that ignited a flame of resistance, one that would burn through Salamis, Plataea, and beyond until Greece stood victorious. The lesson of Thermopylae is one that transcends time. Sacrifice lies at the heart of every great story, every enduring legend. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans knew they would not survive, yet they fought anyway. Because some things are worth more than life itself. Duty, honor, freedom. These ideals compelled them to hold their ground when retreat was still an option. That willingness to sacrifice became a rallying cry. It gave courage to hesitant allies, inspired poets and historians, and carried forward into countless generations. From the Roman legionary to the modern soldier, from freedom fighters to ordinary people resisting oppression, Thermopylae has served as a reminder. True strength lies not in numbers, but in resolve. The echoes through history. Throughout history, Thermopylae has been invoked whenever small bands faced overwhelming foes. In the hills of Scotland, at the walls of Vienna, in the trenches of modern wars, the cry of "Remember Thermopylae" has stirred courage. It reminds us that there are moments when survival matters less than principle, when the choice to resist becomes more powerful than the act of winning. This is why Thermopylae is still taught, still studied, still remembered. It is not simply a Greek story or a Persian story. It is a human story, myth and reality. Of course, history and legend intertwine. The Persians may not have numbered in the millions, and the Spartans were not alone in their defense. Thespians, Thebans, and others shared their fate. Yet the myth of the 300 persists, because myths capture truths deeper than numbers. They give us something to believe in, something to aspire to. The day 300 Spartans resisted an army of 200,000 warriors was not the end. It was the beginning of an idea that even the mightiest force can be resisted, that even the smallest group can inspire millions, that even in death there can be victory. As long as humanity tells stories, Thermopylae will be remembered. The past may have widened, the stones may have eroded, but the courage of Leonidas and his men remains eternal. They showed the world that there are battles worth fighting, even when they cannot be won. So when you hear the story of the 300 Spartans, remember, it is not just history. It is not just legend. It is a mirror, reflecting back the truth that within each of us lies the power to resist, to sacrifice, to endure. And that is why, centuries later, we still stand in awe of that narrow pass, where a handful of warriors chose immortality over surrender and carved their names forever into the story of mankind.